And now our next session is Sit Down with the CISO, where we'll be talking with ThreatX Field CISO Jeremy Ventura about the risks with sensitive data exposure and data breaches. Jeremy, thanks for joining us. Now, Jeremy, I realize that this topic might not be a surprise to you and I, but I was hoping that you can help open up the conversation by explaining more broadly why attackers are targeting APIs and applications more and more over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. So, from a broad perspective, as you just mentioned, APIs are ever growing and ever expanding within organizations. We see APIs being used in all different types of industries, from healthcare and how do I access patient data or an MRI versus banking information and how do I access a credit report and then send that to my bank. And so, because the APIs and internally within organizations are being heavily utilized, that also means the increased usage is increased risk. And so, with that being said, in history and over time, when we look at some of the different security incidents that have faced APIs and applications, a lot of it comes back down to the fundamentals, right? Are we doing the proper basic things to secure and protect our APIs? And we think about APIs and even the examples I just gave. We think about the type of data that's being sent or transmitted over these APIs. We can have, to your point, and the topic of this conversation is sensitive data, right? We could have credit card information. We could have PHI information or healthcare information. We can have PII information or company secrets. And so it's really vital that organizations are ensuring they're putting the right defense in depth and right mechanisms in place to secure these APIs. But yeah, the problem to your expanding or the problem to your point is APIs are ever expanding, right? We're using them more and more and more. And a quick little fact there is all internet traffic, 80% of that is an API call or a push or a get. And so that just shows you how much organizations and developers and engineers and security teams are leveraging APIs to conduct business.
And Jeremy, I think you brought up a few really good points around how organizations are adopting APIs more and more. There's more data, some of it being sensitive. Can you just hone in a little bit more specifically around the risk associated with sensitive data being a part of these API services?
Yeah, so with sensitive data, as I mentioned before, at different types of examples, sensitive data is a really broad category. And sensitive data could be a form of PII information, such as first name and last name, or date of birth, or gender. But sensitive data could also be company secrets, or if we're creating a new product and we haven't released it to the public yet, that's potentially sensitive data that could be called upon via an API call, for example, or a push, or a get, or a request. And it's super important for organizations to understand the APIs that are transmitting or storing or pushing sensitive data, first and foremost, getting visibility into what those APIs are. From there, again, it's putting the right mechanisms and security controls in place to ensure that these APIs are, in fact, secure. So looking at things like authentication, who's authenticating to the API, or authorization, who's authorized to access that API data. Is it a machine? Is it a human? Even going to encryption. So making sure we're using the best standard and practices from SSL or TLS 1.3 or whatever it might be. And so when we look at the fundamentals, what's is interesting is because these fundamentals apply to more than just APIs. They apply to almost everything we do in cybersecurity, including identity and access management, right? And so when we're looking at some of the recent incidences or breaches that have happened against APIs, usually for the most part, it's coming at looking at sensitive data, and then it's using one of these forms to go and attack the API. And we've seen that in history, just recently here in the news with a big DNA genetics company where they were hit with a credential stuffing attack. And we're talking hundreds of thousands, if not millions, when this investigation's over, of how much data was actually lost. And we think about a credential stuffing attack that's really reusing usernames and passwords from other potentially data breaches, and then going and targeting a login page or some other type of form that holds credentials or access to a website, and pumping that website with usernames and passwords as many times as possible to crack the code and to get into that system. But when you think about it from a technical standpoint, credential stuffing isn't really that technical, right? It's really reusing usernames and passwords again from other data breaches to try and become or exploit the individual or their credentials or lack of security there is. And so when we think about some of the different types of attack vectors and attack types of how people target APIs, really, when we think about why are hackers motivated, usually it's financially. It could be brand reputation. It could just to be a pest and a nuisance. But where's the crown jewels? It's APIs that have sensitive data, to the point of this conversation.
Now, Jeremy, I think you hit on a few really important points when it comes to some of the most recent data breaches. Could you help to just break out, how do you think individuals versus organizations can best prepare themselves to not fall victim to an attack like that?
Yeah, so specifically with some of the attacks I was talking about, like credential stuffing, the first and foremost, we've heard this many times in our careers in the industry, but it's applying multi-factor authentication where possible. And multi-factor can mean many different things, whether that's using a third-party service to confirm your identity, whether that means not using a weak username or weak password, right? There's all different types of forms of multi-factor, and making sure that regardless if it's an individual or an organization, you are embedding those best security practices as best as possible. Not every technology or application is going to allow you to do multi-factor, is what it is. But where possible, definitely making sure you apply that type of mechanism and that type of process. But it goes beyond that. And I think for the first and foremost, for organizations and security teams, it's again breaking down the core fundamental practices of API security. So it really starts with documentation and visibility, understanding what are those APIs that potentially have sensitive data, what are they connecting to, who owns those data, how is that API or that code written. So we call that API schema management. And then from there, you start to build what we call a catalog, right? You start to build a database or an inventory system of, okay, here are all my APIs that are publicly facing or external or internal. Here are the ones that may have a higher risk tolerance to them because they do hold sensitive data. And from there, am I applying the best practices and security measures as best as possible? So it starts with visibility for security and IT teams, cataloging that, making sure you figure out who owns that, what data has access to, and then we start to build upon some of the different mechanisms that I talked about. So applying authentication, encryption, input validation, rate limiting, right? Can the API stand hold to a DDoS attack, for example? What does that look like? What does baseline traffic look like for this API? Am I a candy shop and Halloween being right around the corner? Is it normal that I'm having spikes on my APIs or applications because maybe a third-party warehouse is trying to buy candy for their store? So maybe that's normal. And that's kind of a wild example, but like maybe that's normal for some organizations, but sometimes maybe that's not. Maybe in the month of May, it's not Halloween. We only sell candy corn. And in May, why am I getting a huge spike? Right. So make sure you baselining that traffic, making sure you find the anomalies of that. And then from there, making sure you make a decision and decide and act. So there's many different factors. Again, I kind of used the term in the phrase before about defense in depth and defense in layers. It's putting the best also tools and technologies and training your people to make sure that you do have multiple areas of protection within that network.
Now, I think you hit on a lot of really important points as far as how organizations can get started, how individuals can start to think about protecting themselves. But I want to also shed light on the fact that API security, it's a new market. We've heard feedback that there's some confusion around how folks can really get started and start to think about creating their API security program. Jeremy, is there any advice that you'd want to share with security practitioners who are starting to own API security?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing I'll start with is a little stat. So Verizon, for those who don't know, come out with a annual Verizon data breach report. And it kind of looks at the past 12 months in the year, and it says, okay, out of all the breaches and incidents that we've analyzed, what was the attack vector? Was it email security? Was it web applications? Was it brute force? Was it social engineering or insider threats? And then what did that lead to? Did it lead to things really bad like ransomware or a data breach? And so I think this is the first time ever that web applications actually became the number one attack vector. It was just roughly over 60%, or just about 60% of all data breaches. The attack vector was web applications. And when we think about web applications, well, how are web applications powered, right? It's APIs. APIs are the blood or that connected tissue between applications and how information gets shared, as we're mentioned before. And so that in itself should get security leaders, CISOs, CIOs, their ears kind of tuned in a little bit of like, wow, it's not necessarily email security anymore, which, email security has always been kind of the top of the list in phishing, and it's still high, but web application took that top spot. And when we think about web applications, I believe, and don't hold me to the exact number, I believe it was like 85 or 86% of how web applications were actually breached. Credential stuffing is what we were talking about before, or you reuse credentials. And so right there, applying industry trends, applying real world examples is really important to understand the threat landscape, but also help you justify why potentially you need to put a budget or a program around API security. From there, I think for all organizations, we need to look at what is our public facing uh, presence, right? So do we have websites? Do we have information that other organizations or third-party supply chain partners can access, or even consumers can access? Again, I give examples of healthcare, finance, right? We see it everywhere, from water treatment facilities. And I was talking to one water treatment facility recently, and they have a bunch of external APIs. So if water levels get too high within a town or city, there's API calls that go to an emergency management system that can actually send alert notifications that to send to the users or the actual residents of that city or town, saying water levels are super high. It could be an emergency. So we think about all these different examples and how API powers the world. For you as a security leader looking into your own internal organization, again, it's understanding, where's my data? What type of data are we storing, transmitting? How do other people access that data? And then it's building that use case, or building that that program out to make sure that you are putting the best practices and asking for the right resources from your board or your C-level management. And one of those approaches I always like to say is really the difference between risk qualification versus risk quantification. So breaking that down a little bit, risk qualification is more of your tactical metrics. So this is looking at risk from typically is this API because it holds sensitive data medium, or is the risk level high if it was breached? Versus taking a look at the risk quantification and quantifying that and saying, what is the likelihood that we would lose revenue, for example, or how much revenue we would lose based upon the impact that if this API went down, it would potentially either cause a data breach or affect the entire application. And now we have system degradation and nobody can access our website. And we've seen real life, again, examples of that where, without calling out names, people go run to, for example, the big ticketing websites and try to buy that concert ticket. Oh, the tickets are on sale. Let me go buy. And sometimes what would happen if that ticketing website just went down? Or you're trying to find a new pair of shoes and you go to a website and you're trying to buy it, right? Because it's a limited release. What if the website was just completely down, right? There was so much overwhelming access or information trying to people access that website, it just completely shut down. And so when we look at all these different examples, it's important for security leaders, again, to use these examples in your presentations, in your use cases, right? Taking that risk quantification about looking at business impact. Again, I think from everyone's perspective, and this kind of goes a little bit beyond API security, as security leaders, we are in the business of protecting the business. I know that sounds a little weird, but we are actual business leaders. And we need to look at security from that. So we need to be able to speak in dollars. We need to be able to figure out, optimize risk comparison and prioritization. So where is the highest risk in my organization? And then taking that quantitative approach, as I mentioned before.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was really insightful. The last piece that I wanted to ask you was, for security professionals that are preparing themselves to really secure those APIs with sensitive data, are there specific capabilities or technologies that you think are important to ensure that they stay protected?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are definitely multiple technologies or processes and mechanisms that you can put in place to ensuring that those APIs, to your point, that are holding sensitive or PII information are secure. I've always believed in security. You've got to take, and I mentioned this before, but the defense in depth or defense in layers approach. And starting with that, I mentioned the concept of authentication and authorization. And I think API gateways are purposely built for that, where they act as the mediator between the API and actually the external client. But they can enforce different things like an authentication or an authorization policy. They can validate request and response and provide other security features such as rate limiting, as I mentioned, or throttling. But taking that even to a step further, I also mentioned encryption. So again, ensuring that you are encrypting might sound obvious, but ensuring you're using the best practice and standards, as I mentioned before, with like TLS 1.3 or 1.2 or SSL. Same thing with OAuth and tokens, and how do I authorize again to those APIs? So whether they're JWT tokens or OAuth. From there, we go into two more concepts that I like. The first one is, now that I've got the right tools and technologies in place, I think the next appropriate approach is, am I logging this information? And so, especially for the blue teamers in the world, those are your incident response analysts, your SOC engineers, your SOC analysts that are looking to defend the organization, playing defense, making sure you have the right logs in a centralized location, whether it's in a SIM or a data lake or some other platform, but making sure it's not just logging, but you're monitoring those logs, right? You're putting technologies, or you have the right investigation in place to say, this doesn't look right, so maybe I need to go investigate this or mitigate this threat, or I have to effectively respond to that. Last but not least, I also think it is investing in really a true platform. And there are a bunch of vendors out there, ThreatX being one, but investing into a vendor that provides a platform that can cover a lot of this, but specifically around API and application protection, and looking beyond just your OWASP top 10. And, we have OWASP top 10, and those are great. However, we've known attackers have evolved over time. They're becoming more sophisticated. They're doing more reconnaissance. They're probing at your network longer and longer to see, how can I actually get in? And a lot of technologies out there won't be able to pick up on that, right? They're really static or signature based, where they're saying, if A is true and it adds to B, give me C. And if that happens every single time, then yeah, those technologies are great. But what happens is A is squared divided by 3 plus 6 plus 5. I'm getting into math now, but what's happening is attackers are learning how to evade those technologies. And so really investing into a platform that can do a bunch of things, such as API protection, bot attacks or bot defense, DDoS attacks. When we think about sensitive data, again, we go back to some of the examples that you've provided and I provided throughout the session, whether it's credential stuffing, SQL injection, using a bot to attack you, right? A lot of these mechanisms of how attackers are going in are through programmatic access or some type of API automated scripting, where they're going in and they're attacking or overwhelming a machine to make sure that they can either get into that network or get into that application. And when we think about some of the ways they do that, it's really around bot attacks, right? Taking multiple different IP addresses from all around the world and then masking those, and then trying to figure out, how do I get in to evade those detections, or overwhelming the website, as I mentioned before, with DDoS or distributed denial of service attacks. And so really investing in a true platform that can look at that, provide risk scoring so it has contextual insight on your business and your applications is super important. Again, it moves from the static and signature based to more of a behavioral contextual insight and availability for you that can actually understand your system, and then provide an output. These are the actual actions I need to take. Or the system can do that automatically for you and say, nope, we know this looks bad. It hit a certain threshold or risk score. We're going to go ahead, for example, and block that attack right away. And so really wrapping that around into a true platform that can do multiple different things. Because let's face it, as we enter 2024, a lot of CISOs and security teams, we are naturally having to, we're forced to consolidate, right? And that's consolidate budgets, that consolidate tools and technologies. And so the better I can get a platform that can handle all of those different types of systems or different types of attacks, is going to be better off for my organization.
Thanks so much, Jeremy, for spending the time with us today. And again, folks, for those who haven't already listened to our demonstration, ThreatX discovers APIs, detects threats, tracks attacker behavior, and blocks attacks automatically based on risk for APIs and applications. To learn more and get a personalized demo, visit us at threatx.com, and we look forward to talking with you soon.